For most people who want to plant a blue conifer, the first one they're going to run into in the horticultural trade is the Colorado blue spruce. And it's the most popular by far, and it's pretty much sold nationwide. And although it would be possible to grow it in the Mountain West and maybe the northern tier of the country, when you get to wetter regions, you run into a problem with several different types of fungi that can attack the foliage and even the roots. And those problems are way worse in the southeastern U.S. because of the heat and humidity that the Colorado blue spruce is not accustomed to. So what I've tried to do in my collection is trial a bunch of different blue conifers that are not Colorado blue spruce to see how well they perform. This first one I'm going to show you is actually a Norway spruce, the species Picea abies. It comes from Europe, and it doesn't just grow in Norway, it grows all over Europe, even down to as far south as northern Greece. So it has some good tolerance for a variety of soil conditions and a variety of climates, actually. I wouldn't plant it in a tropical area like Florida or the deep south, but I'm in Middle Tennessee, and Norway spruce grows pretty well here, and there are a lot of large specimens around. This one is a blue version of the Norway spruce called Paul's Select, which you can find online. Maybe if you're really lucky you could find it at a specialty nursery, but online is probably the best bet. So the reason this is much better than Colorado blue spruce is because it's more resistant to the Rhizosphaera needlecast and the Stigmina needlecast, which are two water molds that kind of splash onto the foliage of the Colorado spruce and kind of destroy the tree from the ground up. It starts to lose needles, and it loses more and more needles every year until eventually the whole tree dies from the bottom to the top. Norway spruce is resistant to that. Also, this is going to be pretty fast growing, and maybe even faster growing than the Colorado blue spruce. You can see here, it looks like it's put on about 5 or 6 inches of vertical growth on the main leader, and that's probably the most you could hope for from even the best performing Colorado blue spruce. So better adaptability to the mid-south, better fungus resistance, and the roots are going to be more resistant to different types of fungi that attack the roots, and faster growth. I can't think of any reason why someone would buy a Colorado blue spruce once they become aware of the existence of the Paul's Select Norway spruce. The only reason they don't is because it's not widely known, and blue spruce, Colorado blue spruce, is just already established as a nursery stock that's grown everywhere, and people demand it because that's all they know, so nurseries keep producing it. Now let's take a look at some other blue conifers that you can grow in the Mid-South, and I'll give you some more information about ones to avoid as we move through the collection. Next up we have the Arizona cypress. It's from the southwestern U.S., as the name suggests. Arizona, but also parts of New Mexico, I believe. And there are several different cultivars of this, just like with the Norway spruce. We looked at the Paul's Select cultivar. This is the Blue Ice cultivar of Arizona cypress. You might have to do some searching to find Blue Ice Arizona cypress online, or if you're lucky, in person. Sometimes big box stores will have them, like Lowe's. I believe I purchased this one at Lowe's maybe 5 years ago. But what you most commonly see in the big box stores is a different cultivar of Arizona cypress called Carolina Sapphire. And I also planted a bunch of those several years ago and ran into two problems. Number one, since it's a desert tree, it really doesn't need that much water to grow. And that means that it can grow really top heavy on the top without much of a root ball supporting it underneath. And that led to wind damage. Every time we had a big windstorm in Tennessee, the Carolina Sapphire was getting blown over because of wind damage. The other problem is the Carolina Sapphire must come from the lower slopes of the mountains in Arizona, because when it dropped to -4 here in December of 2022, they all died from the cold. But not the Blue Ice. I believe the Blue Ice comes from some stock higher up in the mountains. It withstood -4 with minimal foliage loss, and also it grows slower, and that means it gives more time for the roots to catch up to the topside foliage, and I haven't had any problem with the tree being uprooted by strong wind. Now there are other cultivars of Arizona cypress like Sulfurea and Chaparral, and I haven't tried Blue Steel. That one's curious, very interesting to me, but so far Blue Ice has been fairly reliable. One thing that could be the downfall of this ultimately, I think it may be susceptible to certain cankers, because let me show you why I think that. Okay, we're on the inside of a blue ice Arizona cypress right now, and you can see the white residue where sap is leaking out from one place or several places, and that makes me think there may be a bleeding canker, which is a type of fungus that infects the bark and causes it to leak sap. I haven't lost any yet due to that, as far as I know, but could be a problem in the long run. As with all conifers, you also have to watch out for bagworms. This is a dead one from last year, but where you see a dead one, that means that there were eggs present, and so I'm going to have to be vigilant this year to make sure they don't crop up again. But that's true with all conifers, so that's not a strike against the Arizona cypress. I just happened to find that one. Other than that, it seems to be pretty disease-free. For growth pattern, I mentioned it's slower growing, but it does have a good conical shape to it, as you can see. You could do a little trimming, and unlike the Norway spruce, which eventually will become a massive tree, this one stays a little bit smaller in stature. I doubt it would get much bigger than 25 or 30 feet, given a very long time to grow. And it's always going to maintain that dense conical form with foliage all the way to the ground if you want it. But it's pretty fast growing, actually. I think this one started off as a maybe 1 foot tall tree, and 4 or 5 years later it's already over 10 feet tall, well over 10 feet tall. So grows fast and then kind of stops growing at some point. And they've slowed down noticeably after just 5 years. There's one of the cones, and it has a really good fragrance. I like the fragrance. It's pretty strong, kind of unique, and every now and then you'll be standing next to it and just smell it, but definitely a conifer fragrance, which is really good. A lot of people like that. So there's a lot of positives about the blue ice Arizona cypress, but for the purposes of this video, as you can see, it's one of the bluest. Now let's look at the one right next to it. This is another one you will see a lot in big box stores, and that is blue Atlas cedar. Native to the mountains of northwestern Africa in the country of Morocco. It grows way up there where there's plenty of moisture to support a cedar like this. It's not a desert tree per se, but it does have really good heat tolerance. And also cold tolerance. This was in the ground when it dropped to -4 here. And although some other cedars that I had were killed by it, this one was not. There was a little bit of foliage loss, but it rejuvenated and has bounced back and starting to look pretty good. For growth structure, you can see it's fairly open. I would not use blue Atlas cedar as a screening cedar because it's kind of open branching structure. Over time it'll get larger and fuller at the top, but as you can see, it's not a screening tree like maybe you could with the Arizona cypress. The Norway spruce also gets to become a large tree. Probably provides pretty good screening when it's younger, but eventually the lower branches will hollow out. So blue Atlas cedar is a good one. Cedrus atlantica is the Latin name, by the way. This is the Glauca cultivar. Sometimes you see the Horseman cultivar, which I think is a dwarf, but this is the full-sized Glauca blue Atlas cedar. And by the way, the Arizona cypress is Cupressus arizonica. Again, cultivar name blue ice. Now, slightly less blue, but still kind of in the bluish category, is a certain cultivar of eastern red cedar. This is the Burkii cultivar of eastern red cedar. And eastern red cedar is native to the southeastern U.S., really the entire eastern U.S. And this would be the toughest tree. The Arizona cypress would do good in a dry spot. This would also do good in a dry spot, but this could also do good in a wettish spot. Not swampy, but gets plenty of water. And very disease resistant. This would be much more rock solid in terms of disease resistance in the southeast versus the Arizona cypress. As I mentioned, it's a little suspect over the long run. This one is not suspect over the long run. This could outlive probably every other tree in your planting. And it gets its bluish color from two sources. Number one, the tips of the foliage are a little bit sea green. And if you look close, you can see pretty light green. There's some of the white powdery substance. With all blue conifers, they're really green underneath, but they have a white powder covering the foliage, which adds that sea green color, and that makes them appear blue from a distance. But as you can see, as the foliage matures, it just becomes green, but still a little bit bluish. The other thing that gives them the blue color is these berries. They start off white, these juniper berries. This is Junipers virginiana. Even though it's called a cedar, it's really a species of juniper. So the juniper berries start white, and then they kind of progress to a dark blue. As you can see, a few of them have already started to mature. And then as the year goes by, they get a darker blue and even darker purple near the end of the year. So in aggregate, they kind of create these frosted tips, and certain years have a thicker crop of berries than others. But the Burkii is very reliable and actually even turns a little bit purple in the winter. And I would say if you're doing a planting of blue conifers in the southeast, you are missing out if you're not trying at least one Burkii red cedar to bring that bluish blue-green color. And it's just a really good tree. Great structure, conical, fairly regular branching, and as I mentioned before, very low maintenance. Okay, let's look at another cedar here. I'm just going to give you a far back view of the tree to show you its overall structure. Very straight trunk, tall, drooping branches covered in blue-green foliage. Let's get closer. This is the Deodar Cedar, the Karl Fuchs cultivar. And there are a lot of cultivars of Deodar Cedar out there, but Karl Fuchs is one of the only two that I would really recommend planting in Tennessee or maybe Kentucky, because it has better cold tolerance. A lot of deodars would be more suited to the deeper south where it doesn't get as cold. I had several different types of deodars when the temperature dropped to -4, and they all died except for the Karl Fuchs cultivar. And you can see, like all the other blue conifers, it really has green needles with a white powdery substance covering it to give it that sea green frosted look. The needles are a little bit closed now because one of the things this cedar does is close its needles when it gets wet, and these will open back up and look more like little florets when the sun comes out here. So kind of an interesting tree. Native to the mountains of the Himalayas, the Karl Fuchs cultivar in particular comes from the high mountains of Afghanistan. And that's important because it gets much colder in Afghanistan than it does in the rest of the Himalayas, like Nepal and India. So you want the Karl Fuchs. The other one is the ice regan, even more rare than Karl Fuchs, but it also has cold tolerance. So when you're at the store and you look at deodar cedars, if it's not Karl Fuchs or ice regan, then you need to make sure you're further south when you're growing it, because if you're in something like Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, maybe North Carolina, where it can get very cold, like below 0 or approaching 0, I wouldn't get any other deodar besides Karl Fuchs or ice regan. But they're a really good tree, probably better suited for slopes and drier areas. You don't want the roots to get too wet on this species. Good drainage, but it's also not a desert tree either, so it needs some water. I just wouldn't put it somewhere where it gets too much water. Really great tree though. It has a nodding leader, which means the leader kind of droops to the side, and you might be thinking, why is this tree drooping and not growing straight? But eventually it straightens up, so just be aware of that. Real quick, here's a smaller specimen of the Burkii red cedar I mentioned earlier, just to show you the appearance and the overall blue qualities of it. You see it's loaded with berries, and it is has the blue-green foliage compared to these other trees surrounding it. So once again, Burkii, really good bluish colored conifer. Now here's another spruce. This one is not as blue as the Paul's Select Norway Spruce, but you can see it's kind of got some blue coloration on the needles there. Overall, it has a bluish green appearance, especially compared to the other trees surrounding it here. This is a species, a cultivar of white spruce called Black Hills Spruce. So these are very common. You can see these at Lowe's all the time. And it's a really tough tree. pretty resistant to the different blights I mentioned, like Rhizosphaera, that would affect the Colorado blue spruce. And the special thing about this one is I think it's a little bit more shade tolerant than other spruces. Most spruces need full sun. I think this one can tolerate partial sun. And also, in terms of wetness, if you have a spot that's just a little bit more wet, like if you had a sloping yard, but there's also a flat spot that's not as sloping, and you want to grow a spruce there, this would be a good one for it because it has more wet tolerance than most spruces. In terms of cold tolerance, you will not kill this tree due to cold weather, except maybe if you live in the tundra of Alaska, because this tree is good down to -40 probably. So really cold tolerant, but it's also done fairly well here in the heat and humidity of Middle Tennessee. You can see this year it's put on about over a foot of vertical growth on the main leader here, and that's a good sign. Although it is somewhat inconsistent. Last year it only did probably 4 or 5 inches, but the year before that it did maybe 10 inches. So I don't really know what the overall growth pattern is for this tree, but this one looks really good and the others I have look good. So as of now, I am in favor of the Black Hills spruce, and you can find it pretty much everywhere. Picea glauca is the Latin name, but Lowe's is probably the best place to get them. Also forgot to say that the Latin name for Deodar Cedar is Cedrus deodara. And the other thing about cedars is there's a Cedar of Lebanon out there, Cedrus libani. I would not grow that in Tennessee because it's not cold tolerant, but I don't know if that would grow that anywhere in the eastern U.S. because it probably is too wet for it as well. I tried one and did not do good. If you are going to grow one in Tennessee, a Cedrus libani, make sure you get the Stenocoma cultivar, which comes from southern Turkey. Here's a little pine tree. As you can see, looking at last year's foliage, it's got a lot of that white striping on the needles. The new foliage is not as strongly blue, but it's just now leafing out for the spring. So as it gets older, it will mature to this darker blue-green two-tone needle coloration. This is the Japanese white pine, Pinus parviflora. This cultivar is Glauca, and it's fairly slow growing. And so if you want a slow growing bluish colored pine that can survive pretty cold temperatures but also still live in warmer temperatures of the southeastern US, I would say Japanese white pine is a good choice. There are many different cultivars, and probably every one of them would do just fine here. As far as I know, it's not susceptible to the pine wilt nematode since it's a white pine. But it is pretty slow growing. Here's another bluish colored pine with those two-tone needles. See white on one side, green on the other. This is the Vanderwolf Pyramid pine. I'll show you a larger specimen. Okay, here's a bigger one to show you the overall growth habit of the Vanderwolf Pyramid. And the new foliage doesn't come out as blue, but it will mature to the two-tone overall blue look of it. And it's kind of got a nice blue-green color. Somewhat open branching structure. I'm not sure I would use it for screening unless you have multiple layers of it. But you can find these at Lowe's as well. Species-wise, there's a little bit of a debate whether it is Pinus flexilis or Pinus strobiformis, but essentially this is a western U.S. native pine tree, probably from New Mexico. Good heat tolerance, good drought tolerance. I would plant this on a slope, a northern slope, maybe even a southern-facing slope. Probably not in wet areas or areas that get a lot of water, but it's also not a desert tree. It needs some water. So it seems to be a reliable grower here in Middle Tennessee, and definitely super cold tolerant, and seems to be heat tolerant as well. So I'm hoping it will be better than the native eastern white pine that you see a lot of around here. There's been some decline in eastern white pine, and actually the Vanderwolf Pyramid is much bluer than the white pine, so I like it better. I have a number of very rare and hard to find conifers in my collection, and this is one of them. But it's also one of the blue ones, so I'll show you this. This is the Coyama Spruce from Japan. This cultivar is the Budgeberry Blue cultivar of Coyama Spruce, Picea koyamae. And you can see it's got that nice blue-green foliage, and as the year progresses, it becomes a little darker blue-green, but it still has the white stripes on last year's foliage. This is a small specimen. I just planted this a couple years ago, and it's put on pretty good vertical growth this year, 4 inches or so. So if you can find the Budgeberry Blue cultivar of Coyama Spruce, I do recommend growing it in Tennessee. Here's another bluish green spruce here in the foreground. You can see I've got an Arizona cypress in the background, so it's not as blue as that, but the new foliage is slightly less blue than the older foliage. This is the Jang Spruce from south central China, and it does become a little bit more blue as the year progresses. This one has been a reliable grower in terms of vertical growth here in Middle Tennessee, and it's been proven cold hardy. Some people would say it can't survive extreme winter cold. Jang Spruce grows in a region of south central China which doesn't really get that cold, but it is warm and moist, and that's a good thing for Middle Tennessee. But it actually is cold tolerant, as I mentioned, so it's a very good tree. Maybe one of the best ones to be growing in Tennessee, actually. Extremely rare though, so if you can find Jang Spruce, Picea leekiangensis, give it a try in Middle Tennessee. Next to that, we have the Chihuahuan Spruce, which has been fairly reliable, but this year there's been some problems. This is from the mountains of northwestern Mexico. It's a spruce, and it is a Picea chihuahuana. I lost the main leader and a lot of the buds here at the apex of the tree this past winter. I don't know why, because it did fine when it dropped to -4. And there's also been what looks like some problems with maybe fungus on a few of the new sprouts this spring. It's been a wet spring so far. So we'll see what happens long term, but I would say that Chihuahuan Spruce, although amazing, is maybe not the most reliable spruce to grow in Middle Tennessee in terms of a blue conifer. Moving away from spruces now, let's talk about fir trees. A lot of people don't know the difference between a spruce and a fir, and really, visually, there's not much difference, but they are a different genus of tree with a whole bunch of different species. This is one of the more common ones you can find in the horticultural trade, although in general, firs are fairly rare. This is a Korean fir from Korea, and this cultivar is called Horseman Silverlock. What makes it unique is the needles are very curved, and they are curved to show the white undersides with that powdery glaucous material covering the green needles underneath. And overall it gives the tree a somewhat frosted look and appearance. Pretty cool. As the tree gets larger, this one's fairly small, but as it gets larger, there'll be less of the white at the bottom, and it's more of a dark green, but the tops will be frosted and the tips will be frosted. So really cool tree. Not exactly blue, but definitely in the same category. You can probably find it online, very rarely at nurseries. Horseman Silverlock Korean fir is a good addition, and it has grown well for me so far in Middle Tennessee. Here's a different example of that same Horseman Silverlock Korean fir. And one thing I want to tell you about firs is the roots can sometimes be susceptible to a lot of damaging fungus, like Phytophthora root rot, that can kill a lot of fir species. So they're commonly grafted, and the best fir species for rootstock is the Japanese fir, Abies firma. So when you're buying firs online, if you can find it grafted onto firma, or sometimes it would just say on firma, which means on firma rootstock, that's a better option for the southeast, because the Abies firma roots are resistant to Phytophthora, and you can put a bunch of different Abies or fir species on top of that rootstock. In this case, Korean fir. Here's another fir. This is the white fir, native to the mountainous western United States. And there have been a few problems with this one. This one's common in the horticultural trade. It's called blue cloak. Abies concolor blue cloak. And you can see I've had loss of the apical buds this past winter. And there's been a lot of needle loss as well. You see, that's last year's needles right there, the darker green color. But each one of those little circles on the trunk The little white circles on the trunk is where needles used to be, and they dropped for some reason. There's a sick looking needle right there. I don't know what's wrong with that one. Hard to focus it. Anyway, something's going on with the foliage on the white fir. I think maybe it's a fungus affecting it. It's not really happy with the heat and humidity. It would be happier in a colder, drier location. Unlike the Korean fir we looked at a second ago, where it gets pretty moist and hot and humid in Korea in the summertime, where the white fir grows in the western US, it stays hot and dry. And so humidity is a real challenge for a lot of conifers. Like I mentioned at the beginning, for the Colorado blue spruce, that same logic really applies to the white fir as well. So I would say this is more experimental and not as reliable as some East Asian firs that can tolerate humidity better than western US firs. One more little detail about this white fir is that it's grafted onto Abies firma rootstock, just like the Korean fir I showed you earlier. And without that special rootstock, the chances of survival are reduced even further. Okay, staying with the firs, here's another fir tree. This is the Vear Fur from the mountains of northeastern Mexico, which means it's going to have better moisture tolerance because the mountains of northeastern Mexico are more hot and humid. I believe this one is grafted onto Turkish fir rootstock, but there's something special about this Abies vearii cultivar right here. This is the Blue Mountain cultivar, and although Vear Fur in general is extremely rare, the Blue Mountain cultivar is even more rare. But it's crucial because if you're growing this as far north as Tennessee, it can get pretty cold, and when it dropped to -4, I had regular Vear Fur and Blue Mountain Vear Fur both in the ground. The regular Vear Fur was killed by the cold. The Blue Mountain Vear Fur was not impacted by the cold whatsoever. So I think if you're growing in some place like Atlanta or northern Alabama, you can risk it with the regular Vear Fur, but if you're as far north as Tennessee or Kentucky, get the Blue Mountain Vear Fur. One last fir here I'll show you. This was a little specimen that I've kind of got wired up to a vertical stake here. This is a hybrid fir, the Lauta Negri cultivar or hybrid of white fir, Abies concolor, and grand fir, Abies grandis. And as you can see, it's got some fairly good blue color here. This one is also grafted onto an Abies firma rootstock for resilience in the ground, but it's also probably another experimental or marginal tree to try to grow in Middle Tennessee. These are both western U.S. fir species. The grand fir is the Pacific Northwest, and the white fir, as I mentioned, is up in the mountains of the Mountain West. So the grand fir addition to this hybrid probably gives it increased tolerance for moisture on the foliage. And the concolor fir part of the hybrid probably gives it increased tolerance for cold and heat. So my hope is that the hybrid between the two will perform better than the plain white fir or Abies concolor. This one is out there in the specialty nursery trade, probably an online order, but another one to potentially add to your collection if you want to get some blue firs, along with your blue spruces, pines, cedars, and cypresses. So those are the list of blue trees that I would try in the southeastern U.S., intentionally avoiding Colorado blue spruce because it has a proven track record of failing. Now there's one other little detail I want to show you about junipers here. Hold on. There are lots of cultivars of blue colored junipers out there, and as I mentioned earlier, the eastern red cedar is actually a species of juniper. Even though it's called a cedar, it's really Juniperus virginiana. And if you look closely, you can notice a few brown spots here and there in the foliage. There's one. There's another little one there. Let's see if we can find one. Here's one. Okay, what's going on with this brown spot? Well, this is called tip blight, and there are a few different species of this fungus. It attacks the tips of conifers. Could be Cabatina tip blight, or what's the other one? Can't think of it now. Phomopsis tip blight. That's the more common one. And it is present in the southeastern U.S. It's another one of those water molds that splashes onto the foliage. Now take a look at this tree overall. You can see there's a few brown spots here and there, but overall the tree is healthy. This is an eastern red cedar, Junipers virginiana. If you planted in the same spot a Chinese juniper, you could have real problems with that tip blight. And if you happen to plant a Rocky Mountain juniper, which comes from the dry, cold regions of the western U.S., you'd have even bigger problems with this tip blight. Because on this eastern adapted species of juniper, it's a minor cosmetic annoyance that has no real impact on the tree. But on the Chinese juniper or the Rocky Mountain juniper, it's pretty much a death sentence and will kill the whole tree. Now you might be thinking, oh, I'm not going to plant a Chinese juniper, and I'm not going to plant a Rocky Mountain juniper either. And then you might turn around and say, I'm going to plant a blue point juniper, or a moonglow juniper, or a Wichita blue juniper. Well, newsflash, those are Chinese and Rocky Mountain junipers. You really need to pay attention with junipers to the Latin name. So this is Junipers virginiana, with the word Virginia, so that gives you a hint, eastern U.S. If you see Juniperus chinensis, that's a Chinese juniper. But that's not the marketing name. They say things like Spartan juniper, blue point juniper, and for things like moonglow juniper, blue arrow juniper, skyrocket juniper, what else? Wichita blue juniper. Those are all the Rocky Mountain juniper. Hold on a second, let me think of that Latin name. Oh yeah, Juniperus scapularum is the Rocky Mountain juniper. So just pay real close attention when you're buying junipers, and I would even avoid something like the Pacific blue juniper, which is a low-growing juniper. I think that may be Juniperus, not sure, some other Asian juniper. The point is, the eastern red cedar, Junipers virginiana, is the one you really want to get in terms of a full-growing tree. There's a low-growing version of this called the gray owl. It's also Junipers virginiana. And there's one blue Chinese juniper, I think it's the Pfitzer, blue Pfitzer, which is more of a bush, that's also resistant to the tip blight. But the others will eventually die, and entire sections in the tops of the tree will die out. And I've tried them and lost several, so save yourself some money and time and stick with the Burkii if you want to get a juniper. And not only is it the most survivable juniper, but one of the most survivable bluish colored conifers overall. So even though you see this little brown spot here, don't let that dissuade you from getting the Burkii, because in the long run it could out-survive all the others. So it's definitely a good option.